right, it's your brother Zion Lex. Sign up for our online academy, which is Learn Torah Hebrew Academy at patreon.com/Learn Torah. There are several classes that we offer. We offer a Biblical Hebrew 101 class for beginners. We have a Biblical Hebrew 102 class for people who are a little bit more advanced. We also have a weekly Torah class. We also have our Patriarchs of the Covenant course, our Matriarchs of the Covenant course, and a bi-weekly rabbinical course. All of these courses can be found on Patreon. Again, that's patreon.com/Learn Torah. You guys are definitely in for it. It's a very invasive class. All of our classes are deeply invasive and very, very meticulous to the T when it comes to understanding the culture, the heritage, and the history of our ancient ancestors. So sign up for Biblical Hebrew at patreon.com/Learn Torah. I am your brother, Zion Lex.
Shalom, shalom, everybody. Welcome to Zion Lex TV for another banger. I hope everybody had a good day. I hope everybody is in great energy because I definitely have, in the form of our great sister, Princess Hadassah Hadara, a very, very powerful lecture for you. Princess Hadassah, if you can, tell us a little bit about your brand and your business just before you go into the lecture.
All right, shalom, shalom, nasi, shalom, mishpacha. I have a small business, Hadara Care Holistic Organics, also known as Hadara Womb Care. So, as a doula and a womb worker, birth educator, intimacy coach, and relationship counselor, I like to combine a lot of my passions into, as my trademark slogan is, healing relationships is nation building. So the vision for Hadara Care is really a holistic and organic trajectory of healing, beginning with women healing from various forms of trauma through self-care as the foundation of the business initially was self-care products. And this serves to bring a somatic experience to the woman through which, in the intimacy of self-care and presentness, she is able to heal through being more deeply embodied and connected to and within her body, being more mindful about her sensorial sensuality, and being able to slow down within herself and embody that femininity through softness, through understanding it's okay to de-armor and be vulnerable in your femininity and feel safe in your body and in your surroundings and even in your psychological paradigms. And the rewriting of some of those psychological narratives of trauma and falsely ascribed socially implemented roles comes through the coaching services that I offer. So we have the physical integrated with the psychological, the emotional, the spiritual, and the work that I do through coaching and counseling. But more importantly, as an overall picture, healing the woman allows relationships to be healed, allows marriages to thrive, and allows beautiful, well-adjusted children to be born, anointed children, loved children to be born who are obviously the future and become a stronger nation. So that's kind of my all-encompassing vision for Hadar Care, and womanhood, femininity, motherhood, birth, sensuality, intimacy. These are all the themes of Hadara Care. And that's my way to give back to the community, to the culture, and implement forms of healing by combining, again, my passions for what I've learned in psychology and spirituality, and even in the physical aspects of what I have to offer.
That's powerful. A lot of times in our community, we have moments where we have people come and possess a various literary and intellectual skill set without always having the machine behind, the work behind right? That the skill set is supposed to build upon. So, it's one thing when we have people on social media, YouTube, Instagram, however that they're getting their message published. It's one thing when we're watching them and hearing their voice. It's an altogether different thing when they're really putting into action the knowledge that they have, which is what you're doing. And I just want to commend you openly and publicly for that, because most people, unfortunately, are talkers,
Hmm.
and very few people in this world are doers. So when we have people that are able to marry the doing with the talking, that's a powerful moment always, and that has to be commended. On that note, I want to ask you to talk to us about the title.
Mm.
The title for today's lecture is "Who is God's Wife?" Before I get to the rest of the part, I mean, you got some explaining to do.
Mm.
How a
Indeed.
lot of people are gonna feel.
Well, I intentionally kind of came out, from get go with the controversy. I wanted to address the elephant in the room. I know, especially in the conscious community, there's so much discourse and debate around whether God has a wife, and there
Mhm.
seems to be this fixation and obsession even with proving that he had to have a wife, and that I tend to see through the Afrocentric community, the pro-Black community, the conscious community, there is so much faith put into this maxim and mantra that the Black woman is God. And we understand that even as empowering as that statement has been for many and may seem, we know that it is rooted in the insidiously wounding effects of our oppression and the division of specifically the Black family, but the family in general. And I'll clarify that later. But this idea of this, what I call this mythical, ubiquitously matriarchal and highly polygynous or polygamous African society, seems to be this romanticized vision of a monolithic Africa that many of the so-called conscious community or pro-Black community seem to hold on to, this idea that, oh, we have to return to the ways of our ancestors, the ancient nature-loving ways, the
Right.
ancient ways where women were revered, women were worshipped, woman was the first god. And as beautiful as that may sound, anthropologically, it's just not true. this
Okay.
never There never was an Africa that reflected this vision. And many rare segmentations of Africa that may have upheld this type of matriarchal society that they speak of were not sustainable.
Right.
And you don't find enduring anthropological evidence of them thriving to this day. So I understand that there's a lot of woundedness behind that narrative and even the idolization of that type of image of Africa. And I'd like to demystify some of the beliefs surrounding what is being called the ways of our ancestors and really reorienting our community into an understanding that this idea that we have to worship at the altar of what some may call blackety blackness, this altar of everything Black is all good and all wonderful and all pure. And this idea that we would compromise internalizing and applying actual truth for the sake of holding on to false narratives out of an insecure need for a feeling of validation, individually and collectively. So, rewriting these narratives is no better than the Eurocentric or European revisionism of our history. It does us no good to revise our own history into this overly idealized glorification of this monolithic Africa where everyone was good and pure and sexually liberated and self-aggrandizing. It does us no good to go to that extreme to combat the narratives of inferiority that have been fed us by our oppressors. And this Black woman is God complex seems to come from that. And unfortunately, we see many more detrimental effects of clinging to that ideology versus what is actually healthily and holistically sustainable for our people.
All right. I mean, no doubt, in Africa there exists matriarchal societies, but it seems and appears that you're drawing a line of distinction between there being matriarchal societies in heartland Africa within various tribes, because again, Africa and its belief system is not monolithic. There are common threads that flow throughout all religious and spiritual belief systems. There are obviously then common threads in African systems, but there is no monolithic system, right? So they all have their differences and their distinctions, and a lot of times those differences and distinctions are drastic to the extent that tribes have gone to war and feuded one with another because of how much they differ in spiritual ideology. So just talk to us for a moment about on what basis are you denying the existence of and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but on what basis are you denying that Africa and its tribes has a system of worship for the divine feminine to the extent that it gives rise to what people are calling today the Black woman is God?
Well, before I answer that question fully, to go back to what you were saying, that's an important point that I'd like to emphasize. The tribalism, even in the discussions about our identity as Hebrew Israelites, the Israelite community, the Hebrew community, Black Jews, etc. Even in these discussions, we have to understand tribalism as a paradigm in ancient times. And I know you've even discussed previously that in ancient times, the concept of racism that we think of nowadays didn't necessarily exist in this form. There was a glorification of tribe and nation, and this is across all continents and cultures. So this idea that, Pan-Africanism, as noble an ideology and philosophy as it has been and is for many, there is also the danger of the extreme of saying, okay, we're all Black, we're all African, and to single out really a minority of practices as what all of our ancestors were supposed to have done. Most specifically, right now we see such a surge of adoption of and assimilation to, per se, the Yoruba religion, the Orisha worshiping traditions, whether Nigerian rooted or even the so-called New World, Lukumi, Santeria, Candomblé, 21 divisions, these derivatives from enslavement in the Americas. This idea, even perpetuated by the likes of Beyonce and her Black is King and many of her music videos and iconography that evokes the deities and philosophies of the Yoruba religion. We see that very systematically our enemy is pushing this upon us as a people to capitalize off of our collective ignorance of our identity. So we're being fed various identities, where once we were fed this European Christianity, and that was a form of oppression that was highly manipulated. Now we're being fed the very idolization that brought us into captivity to begin with. And I'll clarify that more later. So when we have this idea that all or even most of Africa was polytheistic or animistic or shamanistic, when that's simply not true, it's very dangerous for us to adopt these beliefs and say, oh, this is what our ancestors were really doing before we were introduced to that quote unquote white God or that Abrahamic monotheistic religion. And many in these systems, we have to realize that, as they say, all skin folk ain't kinfolk. So everyone who was Black, everyone who was African, were not friends. We're not friendly, so to speak. So everyone was not rallying together. And again, this only comes from the woundedness with which we seek belonging, we seek community. So having been scattered amongst the nations in the so-called diaspora, having been ripped away from our identities, our languages, our cultures through enslavement, whether the trans-Saharan or the transatlantic slavery enslavement, we have to realize that this thirst for community and belonging has to be quenched in the right way. And I think a lot of that comes from being educated more about our cultures, being educated more about even genetics and going into bloodlines, finding our ancestry, which a lot of us are doing, which is great. 23andMe and Ancestry.com and all of that is kind of booming now. And that's a great way to heal through finding those threads of identity and community. But again, we have to realize, even within the same countries, in Nigeria, you have different ethnic groups, you have different tribal groups, linguistic groups, cultural groups, and all of them are not, just rallying up together, being friends with each other, the way we seem to do here in the Americas with this Pan-African idealism. It's just like we don't go over there and expect in Asia for the Japanese to say, oh, the Koreans are my brother. The Malaysians, we're all one, we all the same. They would never do that. They don't practice the same ways. They don't have the same cultures. They don't have the same lineages and ancestries. Genealogy is so important all around the world, yet we are the ones who have been separated from knowledge of that. And through that denial of that knowledge, we cling to things that can unfortunately be to our detriment. Everything ain't for everybody, as they say.
That's a fact. I want to jump in again and just kind of gauge you a bit. I know your presentation is going to take a good long while to get through it, so this is going to be the last point that I want to interject with. So there's this belief in the conscious community. I'm not sure how conscious it is, but there's this belief in the conscious community that Africa is a confederacy. Not just in terms of tribes, but in terms of beliefs. And that couldn't be further removed from the truth, as we're pointing out in this dialogue, right? Africa has the most diverse gene pool in the world. It simultaneously also has the most diverse spiritual belief systems throughout the world. Absolutely. As you venture from north, south, east to west, the continent of Africa has the most diffuse and the most distinct and the most differentiated different types of spiritual views. No two are exactly alike. No two are the same. Sure, there are some that are compounded from earlier beliefs and later beliefs, but they all have their own unique distinctions. Africa does not have a spiritual confederacy. I think that that's very important to point out, right? And so Among our conscious community, people are always asking, well, if the God of the Bible is to truly be understood as a real living deity, then where is his counterpart? Where is the divine feminine? You go to Africa and the gods have wives. You go to Africa and there are female goddesses. There are gods and goddesses, right? You go to other spiritual systems in Africa, they have a parallel to what the Bible is calling angels, but you see male angels and you see female angels. So in their mind, the Bible has some kind of spiritual alchemical imbalance, right? In that, where is the divine feminine represented? So, how would you respond to those claims and those questions?
Yes. Well, that's exactly what I hope to make clear in
All
this
right.
presentation. So I do agree and very much would like to emphasize that this universe is created by and comprised of everything that comes forth from the union of masculine and feminine. So all alchemy is masculine and feminine. All of the elements of the universe, everything is this beautiful dance of polarity, duality, and complementary natures. So, yes, we understand that there's this desire to see quite tangibly and quite clearly and obviously this masculine and feminine complementary relationship with God and I guess a goddess. There is a question of the creator's androgyny, even. There are some cultures who believe in what maybe, for lack of a better term, defined as an androgynous god, certainly in systems of Hermeticism and what some would call Satanism. They believe in an androgynous, a deification of androgyny, because that's arguable that Satan, the Satan that they believe in, is actually an entity. It may rather be this egregore, as I call it, of consciousness. But nonetheless, there's this glorification and deification of the idea of androgyny as a transcendence of duality. And that in order to have equity in the universe, you have to have an equality of all of the yin and yang, for instance, all of the masculine and all of the feminine, all of the good and all of the evil occurring simultaneously. And there's some truth to that. However, the creator does not need to have a wife in the sense that most people would like to see and believe. And that also comes from this desire to cling to the worship of self, even the deification of humanity through this anthropomorphism of the creator and of deity itself and divinity itself. So we would like to see ourselves, even as we anthropomorphize metaphorically and allegorically God and or goddess, and say, oh, well, he did, or he is, she did. And we want to see ourselves bodily. And then there is that precarious balance. There's that thin line between even the carnality, the belittling of divinity by projecting even human concepts of sexuality into a relationship between deities or divinity. And so, we will go into that in the presentation.
All right. On that note, you ready?
Absolutely.
Let's go.
All right. So this presentation began initially as a discussion on the, some may say, mythical relationship or the Gnostic interpretations of the relationship between Mary Magdalene and who some would call Yeshua or the Messiah, there is a very robust and lively fixation and belief in this sacred marriage between Yeshua and Mary Magdalene, deeply rooted in Gnosticism and other mystic traditions, again, out of this desire to see this King of Kings, this very masculine presence, be married to an equally strong and charismatic feminine figure in order to enact a comfortable sense of balance. There is this belief that Christianity or even Judeo-Christianity or biblical-based traditions have done a disservice by this conspiracy, it is believed, to deny the sexuality of Yeshua, to deny the right of him and his humanity to have a wife, to have children even. And some see it as more empowering not to glorify aspects of celibacy, for instance, and self-sovereignty, but to see that, yes, he was human and he had intimate relationships and he deeply loved and was deeply loved by a woman who was his equal counterpart. And so what I initially had hoped to present with this this idea is to demystify the commonly perpetuated Gnostic teachings and kind of the carnality of their alleged tantric relationship, coming from a background and years of heavy study into tantric sexuality. And again, in my work as an intimacy coach, I'm very passionate about educating about the empowering elements of sexuality, but we have to orient it in the proper sense and in the sense of marriage, but also not to deify it and idolize it and project it into the divine realm where it never really had a place in the way that we think it has a place. So the relationship between Yeshua and Mary Magdalene, for me, is something that's more prophetic and poetic rather than a literal, even carnal sexual relationship. The sensual undertones, even of her anointing him and her reverence for him, the deep chemistry of their companionship even is very beautiful to explore, again, in the right context. However, out of this was just birthed so much more that I wanted to bring to the table and integrate the story of Mary Magdalene and Yeshua with even King Solomon and Empress Makeda, Queen of Sheba, and in a broader sense to root us in the idea that, yes, in a sense, God, quote unquote, has a wife. It's just not who you may think it is. And yes, that masculine and feminine complementary nature and dynamic is absolutely represented in Torah, in biblical teachings, in the worship of the Most High God, but again, not in the sense that many may like to assume and cling to. You can go to the next slide. So before we go into Mary Magdalene and Yeshua and King Solomon and Empress Makeda, I felt compelled to address this idea of, did God have a wife? Does God have a wife? Because again, I see so much of the conscious community fixated on this question and hell-bent even on proving this fact. You can go to the next slide. So, as I said, why does the obsession with proving a mythical, matriarchal, and polygamous monolithic Africa have the conscious community in a chokehold?
Woo! What a question.
And I've inserted here this quote from Jeremiah 44:17. And these are the women of the congregation, the women who have deviated into the worship of pagan goddesses, whether Astarte, Ashtoreth, Inanna, Ishtar, and they are glorifying this worship. They see there is merit in this worship. They are sold on the idea that this is actually blessing them and it's doing no harm. Again, back to our previous discussion, even in the Aleister Crowley maxim, do as thou wilt. So many of us are insidiously and subconsciously, subliminally seduced by this ideal in many forms. You know, we can do what we want to do as long as it's not hurting anybody. It's helping me. You know, even in the Israelite community, we may have people practicing Orisha worship or hoodoo or voodoo or various practices on the side in secret and saying, oh, well, it's doing me good. I'm getting blessings from it. But these blessings are usually tied to these hidden contingencies and resulting in generational curses that many of us are not aware of. So here they said, instead, we will do everything we vowed to do. We will burn incense to the Queen of Heaven and offer drink offerings to her, just as we, our fathers, our kings, and our officials did in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. At that time, we had plenty of food and good things, and we saw no disaster. And in fact, I've spent many years in the spiritual community, the goddess worshiping community, the Orisha community, and within the so-called sister circles or goddess circles, rooted in tantric and yogic practices. And one of the very prominent sisters in the community that I was very familiar with and acquainted with at one point, in fact, she actually, I remember her having this quote on her Instagram page at some point, and she had a portrait of the goddess Inanna, and this was her justification of saying, see, you know, even in your own Bible, even in the Bible, they were worshiping the goddess. They were offering to the Queen of Heaven, and they were being blessed. And so why shouldn't we? But we will see as we continue on to the next slide. You can go to the next slide. This is a graphic of the worship of what is called the Asherah pole or the Asherah tree. And we know that scripture tells us you shall not plant any tree as an Asherah beside the altar of the Lord your God. So the Asherah worship came in many forms. There were some carved idols, statues of goddesses, as well as trees that were worshipped. And what's interesting about this particular graphic on the far right, I specifically picked this image of this tree. Of course, we see it appears to be very beautifully configured in the shape of a woman. However, in the Yoruba tradition, there is a classification of feminine deities, primordial feminine deities that are highly revered and in many ways very deeply feared as they are respected. This conglomeration of feminine deities are known as Iyami Aje, Awani Yawa. And what that means is our mothers. What's interesting is the high priesthood, as segmented in the masculine priesthood of the Babalawos, the fathers of mystery, the high priests, the masculine high priests. What's interesting is they more commonly refer to this group, Awaniyawa, Iyami Aje, as the witches. And the Iyanla, the Iyalaje, the Iyalorisha, the female priestesses, Iya meaning mother, the mothers of mysteries, the mothers Ajay. The mother or the godmothers, the female high priestesses, refer to this conglomeration of feminine power as our mothers. So even linguistically, there's this interesting juxtaposition between how the male priesthood views these deities with reverence and fear, and how the female priesthood views these deities as nurturing maternal aspects, even to the degree that it is said that the Babalawos, when they make offerings to these deities, they have to crawl, and they can't lift their heads. They have to crawl with their faces to the ground to leave offerings to these deities. And they go in groves, which you'll know from scripture. There's much mention of the worship in groups of trees and in groves. They go into the grove to be initiated to Odu Ifa. And what many don't know is Odu Ifa literally means the womb. So the men, the priesthood of men, the Babalawos, must enact ritually the reception of a womb, whereas women innately, obviously, we have a womb already. So we already have the gift of the womb and the afoshe and the mysteries of knowledge that come from that womb-based understanding, or even that womb voice, some may call it, that intuitive internal nature of woman. But the men must go and be initiated to receive essentially a surrogate womb, a false womb in a sense, that is ritually enacted. And even in, well, anyway, I won't go into all that. But again, the reason I picked this image of this tree is in the worship of Iyami Ajay, they often petition and leave offerings at trees that are split in this way. And you may be able to see, even in the shape of the branches being split in that way, we can see the allusion again to the alchemical symbol for the feminine. We can see the allusion to even the shape of the feminine regenerative organs. As you go to the next slide. So here is the argument. So many people want to say, see, we see archaeological evidence that there were Asherah poles and trees and altars built beside these archaeological figures that represent El and Baal. And there's so much of a scramble to enthusiastically prove that the creator, or the God of the Bible, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, did indeed have a wife and shared his worship with a wife and was worshipped simultaneously with a wife figure as Asherah, or Astarte, Ishtar, Inanna, and Lilith. But I would like to say that this so-called wife of God, all of your queens of heaven have been debunked by the timeline. And as Erykah Badu famously told the world, you may laugh because you did not do your math. And you cannot do your math because you are simply not in your word. You are never in your word. You can't line up the timeline to see how the introduction of this goddess worship came at a later date, after the kind of more collective corruption and defilement of Israel. So indeed, yes, they were worshiping Asherah alongside the father, but we have to look at the timeline of when this happened, and that we will explore in the next slide. So here is an article. I won't try to read that now for the sake of time, but on the replay, you all can feel free to pause and read it. I can also, when this is later updated or uploaded, I can post the links as well for these sources. However, you will see Asherah, depictions of Asherah, who is also syncretized with the Egyptian goddess Kedeshet, and we will definitely explore her more clearly in later slides. But it's important to note the timeline of the introduction of and worship of these goddess figures. You can advance to the next slide, please. Here is another depiction. Obviously, we see this glorification, and with good reason. we understand that there is a compelling mystique in femininity that drives us as a collective to desire to worship women, desire to worship mother, the beauty and mystery of a woman's body to create and contain life, to bring forth and manifest from the unseen to the seen realm, to seem to create out of nothing. And I think we all have this primitive longing to return to the bosom of mother, whether men or women. We all desire to return to the womb state of, this deep, warm, all encompassing nurturing. And so it makes sense that humanity throughout the ages has worshiped woman as God, as divinity, as the creative principle, because of course life comes from the womb of woman. So it would seem that woman was and is the first creator, that woman is indeed God. We can go to the next slide. So the worship of Astarte, the worship of Asheray, the worship of many of these goddesses includes this idea of what is in Greek called the hierodule. And this relates even to the principle of eros gamos, which is the sacred marriage. And this is that divine alchemy through sexuality of this union of masculine and feminine to unite with the divine. In Hebrew, these priestesses, these sexual priestesses of the goddess, these temple prostitutes, are known as kadeshim. And of course, we can see the etymological links between the Egyptian goddess. And we'll go forward to truly uncover this concept and who she is. Okay. I'm not sure if we will actually have time to read that, but what I will do for the sake of time, I'm going to come from the book When God Had a Wife by Lynn Pickett and Clive Prince, which you saw on that previous slide. So I'm going to read briefly about Asheray's priestesses, the hierodule, the kadeshim. And she writes, the ordinary folk among Israel's neighbors had their fertility rituals, often to welcome in springtime and to celebrate the harvest. The eminent 20th century American archaeologist and rabbi Nelson Glueck remarks about the other Near Eastern cultures. The excitement of pagan worship and participation in feasts of sacrificial offerings apparently often led male and female worshipers to join together in feverish consummation of fertility rites. At a higher level, there was the sacred marriage, or hieros gamos, where a priest and priestess united sexually to represent the union of God and goddess to ensure fertility and abundance for their people. Then there is cult or temple prostitution. And I'll pause here to say this endures to this very day in basically all forms of pagan or polytheistic worship. Sex magic, sex ritual has always been enacted for fertility in a very physical sense. Some engage in sex worship, sex magic, and orgiastic fertility rituals to increase the fertility of women. Women who are barren may participate in these ceremonies to be blessed, quote unquote, with the gift of motherhood. These festivals may be enacted to bring fertility to the land, especially in agricultural societies, from which, unfortunately, we've been so detached in the modern West. But even in the West, we know that it's still a very real thing to equate fertility with abundance, with material wealth. And sex magic is very much used to this day for abundance and wealth and money rituals and manifestation, law of attraction, etc., etc. And so we know also that sex magic is used in a very diabolical sense even in the, I'm trying to be considerate of YouTube, but in the so-called traffic stops, the phenomenon of traffic stops, and the involvement of women and children who are being taken off the streets and transported many places for diabolical purposes. This is a very real form of temple prostitution that endures to this day. In our previous discussion, even when we did the story of Dinah and Shechem, I went briefly into the Tritaski society in Ghana to this day. And many societies are still practicing the selling of children, babies, who are sold into these cults, who are groomed, and, you know, the R word and the M word, and all of these things are happening to children, and they are brought up into adulthood through these cults to then, through ritual, embody goddesses of seduction. The Marine Kingdom spirits, the Mami Wata spirits, goddesses like Oshun and Yemonja, these sensual deities who themselves are said to be prostitutes. And that's another curious aspect. Even in Brazil, the cult of Pombagira, who is literally the goddess or the deity of prostitution in her many forms, herself said by some to be kind of this derivative of a path of Oshun known as Panchagara or Panchaga. Even to this day, I don't want to get too controversial, but those who know, you know, and there's a festival called Oshun, the Panchagara festival, and most controversially, a few years ago in Oyotunji village in South Carolina, there was a big scandal about several women having been R-worded. And this festival is enacted as this orgiastic rite in which women are claimed. Any woman, whether she's married or not, can be claimed by any man and taken. And these acts of, you know, union can be enacted for fertility and to receive the blessings of Oshun and Eshu, and all of these mischievous kind of masquerade like practices go on during these festivals. And I myself have been to Oyotunji village, and I've seen these women. They've been pointed out to me. I've looked them in their faces. I've seen them. And curiously, they're still there after having been ravished and defiled so publicly and scandalously. They're still there, literally bowing at the altar of Oshun, having been violated in the name of her festival, at her feast, at her, you know, at this rite of fertility. So these things are very real. They're very much still happening to this day. As I continue to read, sacred prostitution sees a priestess literally embody the goddess, it was believed, during sexual rites, either with priests or male worshippers. Although rarely described as such, this is where goddess worship becomes distinctly shamanistic. For the duration of the act, the priestess is not only channeling the deity, she becomes the goddess. The sacred prostitute really is the sacred feminine. So in these sacred rites, the man believes that he's actually unifying with the goddess. He is meeting the goddess face to face through these sexual rites with this woman. Nancy Qualls-Corbett, in her important 1988 study, The Sacred Prostitute, Eternal Aspects of the Feminine, notes that profane prostitutes were not only the sort of women who gave their bodies to men. The degradation of the profane prostitute, she says, who represents the dark side of feminine sexuality, was profound. She was the very antithesis of the sacred prostitute, whose sexuality revered the goddess. So there is this distinction in this hierarchy between what some may call a common prostitute, a street prostitute, a transactional prostitute who lays down with men for personal material gain, and the sacred prostitute who enacts sexuality ritually as a service to an embodiment of the goddess. Quals Corbert is referring to the long-held belief that in almost all known goddess-worshipping cultures in the ancient world, there existed sacred or temple prostitutes. These were either full-time priestesses or the goddess's own worshippers, required to give themselves to male devotees for a limited time. This was intended to be a mystical union in which the sexual ecstasy gave both participants a transcendental insight into the nature of the sacred feminine, but with emphasis on the man's experience. Unlike visits to ordinary streetwalkers, however, the implication here is that they have to experience the divine from the goddess's own handmaidens, for as mere men, they could never do it for themselves. Giving themselves to male worshippers was only part of the temple woman's role. Priestesses of Isis in Egypt, for example, were required to be usually celibate, but as Mann and Lau remark, the cult also contained erotic elements and more than a hint of sacred prostitution. Outsiders, perhaps not surprisingly, dismissed such ritual as beyond the pale, completely misunderstanding its roots in celebrating the goddess's own erotic and passionate aspect. The Roman satirist Juvenal snapped that the priestesses of the goddess Isis were no better than bawds, Isis herself being a favorite deity, or so was claimed among the critics among the Roman streetwalkers. But did such blatantly sexual practices really feature in ancient Israel? The imagery of prostitution, harlotry, and adultery is used throughout the Hebrew Bible when referring to the worship of other gods, and for good reason. Exodus describes the pagan faithful as prostituting themselves, and the prophet Jeremiah accuses the Judahites of committing adultery with stone and wood. The term for cult prostitute, kadesha, is very different from a profane prostitute, zonah. As some may remember, I did go through this etymological delineation and distinction in our previous discussion on Dinah and Shechem. Rahab of Jericho, for example, who provided a safe house for Joshua's spies, was a zonah. Emphatically, though, it is only used of women. The word literally means, and this referring to kadesha, means only holy or consecrated one. So she argues that there's no intrinsic sexual connotation. And what I find most endearingly fascinating, as I've said many times before, is the etymological link between kodesh or kadosh, which is holy, which is set apart, and kadesha. Indeed, the setting apart of a bride, a wife, is in her veiling or her unveiling. And the idea that she is veiled by the man. When a man marries a wife in the Hebrew tradition, he actually puts the veil on her. And in the West, we commonly see the veil being lifted from the bride when the groom meets her at the altar. However, in Hebraic tradition, he puts the veil on her to then designate that now she is set apart to him. She is consecrated just for him. She is cherished and made special just for him. And to shield her from the world, in a sense. And it makes me even think of the proverbial shadow of the Almighty, in which we are shielded from the wickedness of the world. We are betrothed to our God. As his sacred, the apple of his eye, we are protected, we are shielded, we are covered, just as a woman is covered euphemistically and literally by a man, by a husband. A husband is known as the woman's covering, and a spouse is a garment. Well, spouses can be garments to one another, as women also cover men in different ways. I always like to say that man protects physically, and woman protects spiritually. And there's this beautiful equity there. But not to get off topic too much, there is, of course, the hotly debated story of Tamar and Judah, or Tamar and Judah, in which she seems to play the prostitute. And even in this book, she writes where Tamar disguised herself as a prostitute, which strangely involved putting the veil on. And this is an important distinction that I don't think should be taken lightly. Again, with the bride, we have this veiling. And even later on, if we have time and I'm able to get into the likening of the woman to the temple and the holiest of holies, the womb, and sexual union as kind of this enactment of the entering of the holiest of holies in the actual tabernacle or the temple. We see this transcendence of the veil, this crossing of the veil, even maybe even the breaking of the hymen as kind of this parting of the veil to enter this place of mystery, this place of sacredness, this place that is clean and free from any defilement, this place that is the purest of pure that man could access, just as the holiest of holies, the temple. So in the story, Tamar is described as a zona, a prostitute or a harlot, and the fact that she takes payment from Judah in the form of the goat and his implements, his accoutrements, suggests that is precisely what she is. Back home, Judah sent a friend with the goat to redeem his pledge, but she is nowhere to be found. But something has changed significantly. Now she is described as a Kadesha, translated as cult prostitute or shrine prostitute. The only time the term or its masculine counterpart is applied to a named person in the Hebrew Bible. 3 months later, when Tamar is pregnant, Judah is about to have her burnt for her immorality, and thus playing the harlot, which is a crime punishable by death, apparently. But she reveals by showing the tokens that he is the father. Judah, declaring that she is more righteous than I, admits that he failed in his duty of rightly marrying her to Shelah. One of the difficulties with this issue is that the difference between secular and sacred prostitution is not always clear in the texts. It's still unclear why Tamar, once a Zonah, is suddenly a Kadesha. Any possible explanation has obviously been omitted. There may be a clue, though, in her otherwise mysterious donning of a veil before she couples with Judah. Veils were traditionally worn by sacred prostitutes to represent the hidden mysteries of the goddess. I would also like to add, just in my interpretation, through my own experiences with and education of the occult, the veiling, as in many masquerade types of rituals, occurs because you are seeking union with the divine. So through this act, you are presumably no longer your human selves, your human identity. You become the divine and you are enacting this union with the divine. Therefore, the covering, the veiling, then makes a distinction between the human identity of essentially who you're laying down with and the divine aspect that they are meant to embody at that moment. And interestingly enough, the author also highlights that Tamar means palm tree, which was also a hallowed symbol of Asherah. Kadesha appears twice more in the Hebrew Bible, once in the injunction in Deuteronomy forbidding the daughters and sons of Israel from being cult prostitutes, and in a passage in the prophet Hosea's book about the people having left their God to play the whore by sacrificing on mountains and hills where men go outside with prostitutes and sacrifice with cult prostitutes. Well, it's important that we understand the euphemistic use of language surrounding prostitution and adultery conflated with paganism, witchcraft, and idolatry is very intentional in the Bible and in our culture, in Torah and in our culture, because idolatry and adultery are one and the same. We, as a people, individually and collectively, are the bride of God. We are married, we are betrothed, literally, to our God. This was the holy marriage covenant at Mount Sinai. When we received Torah, we received the ketubah. We received the marriage contract binding us to him. And again, God is not corporeal. He is not a man, literally, although we anthropomorphize him as such. However, in this aspect, because of the majesty of his presence, it is most easily understood, I think, in the sense of masculinity, in the way that a woman in her femininity shows softness and deference to man in his masculinity. The complementary nature of this relationship compels us then to view him and relate to him in the masculine, although whether he is literally a masculine deity or not, I think misses the point. And I think again that comes from kind of this brainwashing, for lack of a better word, to these pagan, primitive understandings of deity. And so we also have to understand most pagan traditions are really ancestor worship. And a lot of the deities that are worshipped were seen as once living. We talked about before, even Shango in the Yoruba tradition. This is one of their highest and most widely worshipped deities. But this was an actual man who lived. This was an actual king from the 14th century after after Christ, AD. This is AD times, mind you. This is also very shortly within the range of European contact and colonization. So these ideas that, we were worshiping Orisha for tens of thousands of years. Okay, show us on the timeline. Show us on the timeline, because historically and anthropologically, Shango was a king who lived in the 14th century. So how long were y'all really worshiping these things? And again, essentially, you're worshiping man, you're worshiping creation, you're worshiping that which is fallible and corruptible. Why not worship the creator who is perfect, who is infallible? You're worshiping ancestors who died as men. So, and they've been deified. And so this idea, again, this compelling to view God in this very human sense is a grave mistake, I may add. And so when we understand ourselves as the bride, we're not literally saying he is a man that we are married to, but the complementary nature of how we surrender to him, how we submit to him, how we aggrandize his strength in our humility, in the vulnerability of our humanity, just as femininity in its softness, not a weakness, mind you, but in softness, complements the strength of masculinity. But anyway, I know I've been going on without a pause for a good moment. So did you want to jump in and say anything?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot that I have to say. You did say a lot, but with respect to everybody and their traditions, I believe in calling a spade, right? And where mankind, where we seem to always go wrong, is that we have an obsession with worshiping that which the creator created, formed, and made, rather than offering that worship to the creator. So you have cultures in the world that venerate the moon.
Mm-hmm.
The creator created the moon. You have cultures in the world that venerate the sun. The creator created the sun.
Okay.
You have cultures in the world that venerate all four elements. The creator creates this too. But what a lot of cultures don't have in common is the ability to distinguish these things from the creator, to know and discern that it is he that is responsible for the existence of these things. So a huge part of our legacy, right, is that we worship the one that creates things that move people to wonder and awe.
Yeah.
So imagine that. You're in awe of the creation. Could you imagine coming into just an iota of enlightenment, of being in awe of the Almighty?
Yes.
So, this is the type of teaching we need. This is the type of consideration that we need. And I even want to say tonnage, because what I've been trying to really, really do on this platform is give our women an opportunity to be seen. Because I heard somewhere that in the Israelite community, the women are not, they're not, accounted for. To which I say, not no more. To which I say, we've had many women in the community, but there's a lot of work that happens behind the scenes. You see, we live in a fake world. I'm going to go on a tangent, by the way. Just give me a little time.
Take your
We
time.
live in a fake world. We live in a world that simulates reality. We call that social media.
Mm.
Facebook. If you don't post all day on Facebook, people will be like, oh my God, are you okay? I'm fine. Because there's life outside of that simulated non reality. If I don't go on somebody's YouTube channel, if I'm not commenting, God forbid Zion Lex don't put out a video, Zion, are you okay? I'm fine. There's life outside of that simulated non reality. The world that we live in the last 15 and 10 years has created a simulated non reality that if you are not present in that non reality that they simulate, then people assume that something's wrong with you. And when we add to that equation that in these spaces, there is so much junk mail, so much misinformation, now you have a situation where reality and non reality is no longer easily distinguishable. Real information and information that has no merit is no longer easily distinguishable. So what I'm saying, my sister, in the form of a question is, what do you think it takes, right, in our society right now, in our living, today, for us to come outside of these simulated internet environments and actually take this God skill, this knowledge that we're acquiring, and begin to do work in the community and take that work not only to go back in the past and make corrections, we call that Sankofa, and bring the jewels from the past that need not be corrected into the present future so that we don't fall into many of the pitfalls and mistakes that our ancestors did. So my question is, what do you think is necessary for this generation and this era to go back into the past, to bring into the present future? What should we be looking at? What should we be assessing? How does that even work?
Mm. I appreciate that. For me, this might not be the answer that you're looking for. However, I think just the way I attempt to do that, even with my business, going back to Hadara Care and the foundation and the principles of the passion through which I create and produce and coach and counsel through Hadara Care, is going back to restore that reverence and respect of masculinity that our ancestral cultures did uphold. Again, I think this obsession with this matriarchal system, as much as we pretend to run so far away from these Eurocentric paradigms that have been forced upon us through oppression, we in fact find ourselves binding ourselves more and more to it. We find ourselves assimilating feminism more and more through this so-called Black woman as God and goddess worship, obsession and fixation. And we know that feminism literally was used by the CIA to infiltrate the Black liberation movement. We know that the Black Panther movement and organization in particular was targeted, women, feminism. There were articles written in early magazines, feminist magazines, about how allegedly abusive many of the men of the Black Panthers were to their women behind the scenes. And we even see that now in the conscious community. Unfortunately, some of it may be true, but nonetheless, the demonization of the Black man, and thus the God of the so-called Black man, or the Hebrews, the children of Israel, is, priority number one for the enemy. Whether you see this enemy as Satan, as this ubiquitous collective consciousness or egregore of consciousness, or the so-called European paradigm. So again, coming back to understanding our relationship as a people with the Creator and how we relate to Him as a loving Father, a Creator that is anthropomorphized even as a loving Father. Although, again, I emphasize He's not a man. But I think so many of our people and the people in the conscious community have a problem with that because the system has separated us from the very concept of a loving Father, the nobility of masculinity, the demonization of masculinity by the system, um, by this illusion, this matrix reality. Social media has us pitting men and women against each other. The so-called red pill society, or all of these discussions that are being had to create divisiveness, and then the language around toxic masculinity. And unfortunately, so many of our people are just falling into that trap.
I'll be remiss, since you're on that point, to not hit you with the counterpart. We often talk about toxin masculinity and how there's a great oppression of men upon women. But I have the honor of having an honest sister. And I'm not saying women are not honest, but I know for a fact this is an honest woman. And I'm going to take advantage of the moment. I'm going to ask you, does there exist toxic femininity? And does there exist women that oppress men?
Yes, absolutely. I will come right out the gate and say irrefutably there is.
The brothers
And
asked me to ask you that, by the way.
okay, okay, we'll go. Yes, I will tell the brothers. Yes, there. That is an unfortunate reality, and that comes from feminism. Feminism is a slippery slope, as I like to say. I have a whole video series like on the slippery slope of femininity, and the very dark and diabolical places that it takes us to. Not femininity, feminism. Excuse me. So feminism, again, as much as we try to pretend, oh, we so blackety black, we are removing the shackles of Eurocentric brainwashing, but are we really? Because more and more we're just falling into the trap. Even the LGBT agendas. Sorry, YouTube. All of these agendas levied against us, from the welfare system to women's liberation, sexual liberation, Planned Parenthood, abortion, the pill, casual sex being perpetuated and glorified, this idea that we can do what a man can do. And this woundedness is not being addressed. This reluctance to accept and even submit to this masculine God comes from this resistance and reluctance to see how the system has demonized our fathers, our husbands, our men, the men of our communities, very intentionally and purposely, separating us from our fathers, mass imprisonment and incarceration, the deliberate FBI and CIA orchestrated infiltration of drugs into the community. All of these agendas really to the main goal of dividing the Black family, of even to, oh gosh, how do I put this? It's very controversial, but even the suppression of a coming Black Messiah, perhaps, would be the agenda to divide the Black family, to even sterilize the Black community. And that goes into the LGBT and transformer agenda and all these different forms in which, again, through abortion rights and so many of our women claiming bodily sovereignty and autonomy, claiming the right to have sex with who and how and when they want to, and not be mothers. And there's even now this idea that it's noble to admit that you don't want to be a mother, and all of these things. Women are being applauded for castrating themselves from that maternal nurturing nature that submissive nature, where submission is now like a cuss word in the community. What do you mean submit? That's a renunciation of my power because the Black woman is God. How can I submit when I created man? And this idea that, oh, men came out of my body, so I am God. So how can I submit? And this arrogance becomes this toxic femininity through feminism, this feminist mindset of needing. Now feminism has evolved from wanting equality with man, which we already had. I don't know how we were brainwashed to believe that we didn't, but needing equality with man and equity, even economically, to then competing with men, to now this lust for dominating men. And I've said in our previous discussions as well, even in my past experiences, not only in coaching women, but even in the past when I would do spiritual work for women and do readings for women, they would literally come and be asking me, oh, do you know a love spell? And I literally saw the trajectory go from women who wanted to be loved, although that's not the way to do it. But then it became, oh, do you know a domination spell? I want to dominate him. I want to take all his money. I don't care about him. I just want him to be obsessed with me. This language of obsession. This is a spirit. This is a principality, whether some may call it the Jezebel spirit. I don't know what they want to call it. What I always say is female narcissism in many ways is far more dangerous than the so-called toxic masculinity and male narcissism that they would have us all be so frightened of. Where we have women who are literally ignoring and abandoning their children to go twerk on YouTube and Instagram. We just saw old girl, the robot girl, pretending to be AI, and videos came out where she was literally abusing her child live on camera and then coming back. Women who are being arrested, or police are looking for women who have gone out because they want to sit here in rooms and prostitute themselves and get on OnlyFans and get on Instagram and twerk and do these depraved sexual acts while their children are crying in the other room hungry. So, it just gets really sordid and demonic, really. But again, this rage against the Father, this rebellion into goddess worship, into self-idolatry, because really that's what it boils down to. And as we discussed before, the very spirit of Satanism is self-worship. When you are worshiping yourself, when you're saying, do what thou wilt, I'ma do me, I'ma do whatever I want to do, what makes me feel good, even if that's literally abandoning my children to go to work somewhere, to go to the club, to go have sex with whoever I want to have sex with, to be on OnlyFans. And so, this comes from that rebellion of these wounded women who didn't have fathers, or who have a troubled relationship with their fathers. And
I want to, and I apologize. But we got about 30 minutes left. I know you want to get into some more slides, but I just want to jump in and say something. We live in an unprecedented era, Hadassah. We truly do. And I'm speaking not just to you, but to our listening audience, right? Think about it. When we were coming up, your mom, your dad, your aunts, your uncles, things that they didn't really reach our ears unless it was done in our face. Certainly didn't reach our eyes unless it was done in our presence. Today, you have kids in high school who are shamed every day because their mama give it all up right on the gram. This is unprecedented. I don't know what my teenage life would have been like if my mama was on the gram the way that the women dress today. BBL hair, Miami hair, doing it up hair, showing up for everything but the home and my school and my nurturing. but you make sure that you only fans in it out here. This is a different era, my sister, a completely different era where you can literally go online. Remember back in the day when we wanted to see naughty things, we slide in that VHS that our parents forgot was in the living room, and we'd watch naughty things because children are going to be children. But today, it's way worse because your friends be like, yo, you seen his mother? Yo, I follow her on the gram. Yo, talk to us about that.
It's really tragic. I mean, I have literally spent many a night literally weeping for the children who, even the young boys, we don't think about the children who are being exposed to corn. I think that's the word you're supposed to use for YouTube now, but being exposed to these things. And that's, we just got to keep it real. That's what it is nowadays. It ain't nothing. I mean, anyway, but what it does to the brain of adults, first of all, if you really study the science of what this type of sexual imagery does to the brain chemically, that's a whole lesson in and of itself. But to think about what it's doing to children's eyes, their minds, their brains, their hearts, especially young boys, I very much weep to think about the access that young children, young boys have to these types of images before they really understand what the mystery of femininity is. And the women, again, being in these communities, being in these goddess worshiping communities that I've been in, all of these women, these are the same women who think it's so divine to walk around your children naked. Oh, it's my body. You should see, in Africa, we was walking around naked. And so it's no problem. He needs to see the woman's body so that he doesn't, through the logic is, by being deprived of access to it and it being hidden through modesty, that creates deprivation in the mind. Oh, because it was hidden and forbidden from him, because he's not used to seeing it, then he will become obsessed with it, and then he'll become the rapist. That's the logic of these women. So yes, I'm gonna go twerk in front of my son. I'm gonna be naked in front of my son. And I've seen it. I've seen it with my own eyes, and these are the most depraved households. Oh gosh. The things
It's crazy. I caught the Bob Marley movie. I believe you did too. One Love.
Not yet. Oh, not yet.
You didn't catch it yet?
Not yet.
Great film. A lot of people walked away from One Love saying one thing in particular. It was the way that we saw the women dressed.
I've heard
The
that.
daughters of Zion portrayed in the movie One Love, the way that these black women dressed at a time, it brought tears to many people watching, like, look at us in our beautiful modesty.
Yes.
You and I and several people watching, we remember that the things that people are wearing outside today, our mothers barely wore inside. But the clothing, which at a time in our history, which was reserved for a woman only at home, that's outside clothing now. And it's so common, it's become normalcy to see women undressed. To the extent that if you got something to say about it, you wrong. You're shaming her. So now you need to be exposed. What a time to be alive. It's a different world. And I don't think a lot of us are really, as you made mention of, are considering the psychological and spiritual implications of what these children are going through. Because when the bar is set but so high, children can either go up or down, can only go either up or down. I'll share something with you guys. My parents told me as I was making my way from high school into college that they didn't immediately go to college, that it took some time to get back in. And I was shocked. I thought that they went immediately and got 50, 100 degrees. And they was like, no, we always gave you that impression because we knew and we understood that if you saw the bar was set that high, you would say to yourself, well, all I got to do is come close to it or reach it, and that's it. Look at where the bar is set today. Look at what these young men, look at what these young women have to see, not just in their mothers, but in their fathers, men. We bringing you right back in. Don't think it was hot seat for the women alone. Look at where the bar is set today. Daddy is a struggling rapper at 56. Give it up, homeboy. At this point, it's not a career, it's not a job, it's a hobby. Where you going? Where you going, Cool Herc? You 70, 19, 100. Where you going?
Yes.
You 47 years old, still promoting mixtapes. And because people of that age range are so out of whack with social media, these 40-something-year-old struggle rappers, they still on MySpace promoting this stuff. Homeboy, nobody don't even look at MySpace. What are you doing? But this is where the bar is set, my sister. This is where, it's funny, but this is where the bar is set, right? And mama ain't no different. Mama ain't no different. Because rather than pay for my child to be in a better living space, rather than pay for my child to maybe get the dental care that he or she deserves, rather than pay to put my children on a different living level, what happens with these tax refunds annually? We buying used cars. 3 months from now, we don't know what happened to the car. We going on trips. What are we doing? Where is our mindset for what we are intending to invest in? As cliche as it sounds, the greatest investment for a parent is always your children. There's a time and a place and a space for upgrades to your look. And there's a place, space, and time for taking trips and, going all over the world. But I was taught from a very young age, you invest family and home first. Everything else lasts.
Yes.
Period. Everything else lasts. And we all play a role in that. So I know the women was in a hot seat for a moment, but we all play a role in that.
And again, that comes back to this literally satanic mindset of self-idolatry, self-worship. I'm going to get mine. I'm going to do what's good for me. And it's a childish, I always like to make the distinction between childish and childlike, because Yeshua said to be childlike. That's a whole different thing. But childish, rebellious, immature mindset, the idea, and I think some of it, we have to account for generational traumas. And, many of us as a collective didn't have childhoods. We had to grow up fast. And so then we find ourselves in adulthood chasing that childhood, even at the detriment of our own children, many of which were unplanned, as a collective. These things have happened, again, through the sexual immorality that has been enforced within and forced upon our people. And, this immaturity in our people, the women who don't want to raise their children because they want to be out and be seen, the men who want to chase these rap dreams. This comes from kind of trying to relive your childhood. And that's why a lot of the coaching and counseling that I do focuses on inner child trauma and, really giving voice to that inner child that was repressed, but integrating it in that maturity to put away those childish things, as the scripture says, and really see where your inner child can be channeled in fruitful ways. And that can be through creativity. That can be through literally being with your children, spending time with your children, playing with your children, be childlike with them. That's a whole different thing. You don't want to spend time with your children, but you want to be out here in the streets or in the club acting like a child. But I do want to go back into the slideshow a little bit. I know we have a few minutes. We can just race through some of the slides because I think it's important, even what we're talking about, how this came about through this hierodule, this kadeshim, this temple prostitution. So going forth to the next slide, and we're gonna race through and skip through.
Okay.
You can go to the next one. Okay, the next one, that's the worship of Kadesha and Kadeshet, the Egyptian goddess. Again, I wanted to come back to the timeline because, again, the point I wanted to prove, you're not doing your math because you're never in your word. At the end of the day, they always want to pull up archaeological finds and depictions like this and say, see, they were worshiping El, with Asherah and all these things. But again, this was the 8th century BC, near the Solomonic era. We already know even King Solomon himself fell into idol worship and was erecting Asherah shrines. So you too late in the game. Basically, when you go back even to the emergence of the Proto-Sinaitic, excuse me. I'm gonna figure out how to say it. But the script that even predated the so-called Proto-Cananic writing is, we have to understand the timeline in which we were in Egypt, the timeline of Joseph, the timeline of the Exodus far predates when they are finding these so-called archaeological proofs that Asherah was worshipped side by side with the creator god as his wife. So ultimately, do your math, get into the history, get into your word, get into archaeology, find out the truth, and know that all this stuff that you worship in and that you want to prove was too late in the game. This is already after Israel was being punished for this idolatry. This was already after we started to see the collective damage of adopting and assimilating insidiously the ways of the nations around us by introducing this goddess worship and sharing the creator's glory with these other deities. You can go ahead, please. This is more about the era. This was more, you can keep going about 4 or 5 slides up. This is more about proving the timeline. You can keep going up. This is about the idolatry, the worship of the Asherahs and the different forms that they came in. You'll even see, some figurines that have been unearthed that may have been used for very interesting purposes, that may have also been called the Asherahs. You can go forward and forward again. This you see here is the union in Hindu worship. You have the yoni and the lingam. The yoni, of course, is the Sanskrit word for the woman's reproductive organs, the sacred space, the womb space, and the lingam is the masculine generative principle. So here we see them literally worshiping the flesh. We see them worshiping the reproductive organs, the genitals. You can advance to the next slide. We can see even in very seemingly graphic ways, these are idols. They are literally, using certain substances to evoke the image of blood, as they are depicting these idols, the blood that comes from woman that's being worshipped as the blood of life. Whereas, we in our traditions look at the blood of atonement, the blood of the temple sacrifice. And ultimately, for those who believe in Mashiach, the blood of Mashiach, the blood of Yeshua shed for atonement. But they are literally worshiping the blood of woman, the menstrual blood. And this is very important to note. And I really would like to emphasize this because, again, as a doula, as a womb worker, these days you can't even take a class in womb work. You can't even take classes in midwifery without these women literally saying, yes, the original midwives were witches. Yay, we're all witches. I'm telling you, I've been there to get my certifications just to get certified as a doula nowadays. You are literally being indoctrinated to witchcraft They are telling you, yes, sisters, we are the original witches. We're going to celebrate this. We're going to celebrate our blood. We're going to drink our blood. We're going to put blood on our faces. They are literally doing this. And this comes from these forms of goddess worship, because you are worshiping the creation over the creator. You are worshiping, yes, woman is awesome. Yes, the womb is awesome. Femininity is amazing, literally awe-inspiring. But we do not need to worship the literal genitalia of women, or men for that matter. And this is literally what they're doing in these religions from ancient times to this day. And I don't have time to go into it with the nuance that I would have liked, but this is why the image is very powerful. The image will show you much more than the words can say right now. So again, we have the lingam worship, we have the yoni worship, we have the semblance even of the menstrual blood. And in many of these witchcraft rites, menstrual blood is used. I'm telling you, go down to Atlanta, go to Tennessee. I'm not going to come and expose specific names, but very popular, very prominent priestesses of the Orisha community be getting on here, talk about nothing but the blood, like literally making fun of our old spirituals about Yeshua and talking about their blood, talking about my mama's blood and my blood, so it's just so funny how, our ways are being twisted to again glorify the creation, even in its
Let me ask you just something really quick, not to stop your train of thought, but I gotta ask you this. You clearly are very gifted when it comes to being aware of these things, especially as someone who admittedly once practiced and demonstrated these things. Question: from your observation, do you think these things currently exist in the conscious community? Do you think that there are even people in the Israelite community that may be practicing this type of stuff?
Absolutely. I think we definitely know that the conscious community is very inundated by, if it's not Cometicism, it's Orisha worship at this point. It's Yoruba, that's very popular, popularly practiced even more and more so. And again, these are very much part of their rituals. The glorification even of bodily fluids, whether male or female, the glorification of the phallus. We already talked about in the last presentation about Eshu, Elegua, Papa Legba, being depicted as a literal phallus, and so many stories and myths about his sexual virility and prominence. Even the imagery of the staff that he carries in interesting parallels to the staff of Aaron or the staff of Moses, being this phallic symbol and this metaphor for, the proverbial third leg, as they call it. So we see offerings of blood being made by women. And what's so interesting is in these circles, again, these goddess worshiping circles, these sister circles, you go on these retreats, pay attention to these retreats. Y'all be careful. These retreats that these women are going to nowadays, there's so many retreats, sister retreats, healing retreats, but they're really enacting demonic rituals. They playing with their blood, they playing in dirt, putting blood on their faces, offering menstrual blood to the waters, making waist beads and all these things. And there's a whole thing I wish we had time to go into, even the waist beads and the Mami Wata traditions, the Marine Kingdom spirits. These bind you, anyway, it's so much that I could say. But yes, these practices are being practiced even in secret. And I wrote a paper on the Red Tent, the book. There's a novel by Anita Diamant. Interestingly enough, she identifies as a Jew, a Jewish woman, and even a rabbi, a female rabbi. But she wrote this book, which is I feel, deplorable revisionist feminist retelling of the story of Dina. And from this, what is unique to my field, the Red Tent has now been adopted. I don't even know if many of these people have even read the book or are even familiar with the biblical story upon which it's based, but the Red Tent is now used in circles of womb empowerment and womb health education, birth education, and midwifery to allude to the traditions of the separation of Nida. So in our tradition, we know that when a woman is on her menses, she separates. And there's so much contention in the conscious community, the Afrocentric community. Oh, what you mean my blood is dirty? My blood is divine. My blood is holy. My blood is sacred. My blood heals. And there's power in my blood. Yes, there is, but not in the way that you are portraying it as. And this anger at this internalization that the separation denotes dirtiness or uncleanliness. It's not that it denotes dirtiness or uncleanliness. Even if you were practicing fertility awareness, which is something that I educate and inform about, even in fertility awareness, you come to appreciate your time of menstruation as a time of separation. You should be separated. In fact, that is a time when you should be more withdrawn, more internal. You should be in the quietness of hearing. You become more intuitive during that time. There's so much spiritual potency during your menses. But that's exactly why you should be separated, not because you're dirty and somebody's trying to put you away somewhere, but because that's a sacred time for you to purge, to heal, and also to have a spiritual impartation. Many women may find their dreams are even more potent during that time. These are things you should be paying attention to, not sitting here trying to find empowerment in having sex on your menses, which many women are trying to do. And it's like, do you even hear yourselves? You literally are fighting. You are fighting mad, as they say. You are actually angry, almost like a child, a petulant child saying, oh, I'm mad. I can't have sex on my period. What you mean? And even now in my field, because I also sell health products and intimacy products for, oh, okay. But as I don't know where it cut off, but even in my field, I sell products for fertility, for womb cleansing and healing, and combating issues like fibroids or endometriosis or even bacterial vaginosis and yeast infections and all these things women don't want to talk about. But, the care for the womb, in this, we have to practice hygiene in a way that is sacred. But also we have to understand that we are honoring ourselves, not degrading ourselves, thinking of our blood as dirty by honoring separation. And you have products that are being sold now, and they're actually being marketed to have sex on your period. There's so many ads that I've seen on Instagram where they're selling suppositories to insert in your vagina. And the selling point is literally that you can have sex on your period. They're making little skits and videos and memes to show how, you don't have to be afraid and ashamed anymore. It's not going to have a smell to it. It's not going to mess up nothing. You can go ahead and put that towel down, girl, and go ahead on. That's when that becomes the selling point. We have to really understand like what's going on in the community when we're not honoring the sacred separation of our nidai. And we know that even that, ironically, while people think that that's a denial and a repression of sexuality, that enhances sexuality in marriage. The separation time is not a denial. That actually enhances the attraction to one another. It's like a vacation. You're in separation and you're not in sexual union. And then when you come back together, it's that much more passionate. It's that much more intense and beautiful. So take that time of separation and honor that and listen to your body, listen to spirit, listen to your intuitions and your dreams and visions, instead of being out here trying to be out here twerking and dropping and all this other stuff. But again, this worship of the flesh, this worship of the blood, this worship of sex and bodily fluids, this comes from this goddess worship. This comes from this Asherah worship. And I would like, I'm trying to squeeze it in. If you can go 2 more slides ahead, I'm trying to bring it to a point here. Sheila McGee, that's an Irish goddess who literally many of her iconographic symbols are carved on many churches in Europe to this day. And of course, you see her literally spreading open her vulva as a mystery of creation. And the next slide, please. We have Kali, the Hindu goddess. She's called the Black Mother. There's so much that could be said about her. At one point, I was very much, very fascinated by her mythos and her iconography, very familiar with her forms of worship. And so Kali represents the death of the ego, which is the symbolism of all the decapitated heads that are around her neck and sometimes around her waist. Sorry, one moment. But as you can see most prominently, she as a woman, as a feminine entity, is literally dancing upon the god Shiva. And what I want to bring attention to, I would love to explain this image even more and even her worship even more, and why she's worshipped by a lot of these goddess communities, but we don't have time. But the tongue lolling out is a sign of shamelessness that is glorified. And we see,
Take
even
your
if you
time. Take your time. I just want to just on one moment. Just want to let everybody know we're going to take a quick commercial break to pay these bills. We only got a couple minutes left. Everybody, please, guys, throw up the video, share the live stream. Make sure you go and see the links for Princess Hadassah's website. Go and
All right. It's your brother Zion Lex. Sign up for our online academy, which is Learn Torah Hebrew Academy at patreon.com/Learn Torah. There are several classes that we offer. We offer a Biblical Hebrew 101 class for beginners. We have a Biblical Hebrew 102 class for people who are a little bit more advanced. We also have a weekly Torah class. We also have our Patriarchs of the Covenant course, our Matriarchs of the Covenant course, and a bi-weekly rabbinical course. All of these courses can be found on Patreon. Again, that's patreon.com/Learn Torah. You guys were definitely in for it. It's a very invasive class. All of our classes are deeply invasive and very, very meticulous to the T when it comes to understanding the culture, the heritage, and the history of our ancient ancestors. So sign up for Biblical Hebrew at patreon.com/Learn Torah. I am your brother, Zion Lex.
Caribbean Kitchen, foods offer 7 unique blends of premium, low-sodium Jamaican seasoning that will add a burst of flavor to your dishes. Our authentic, all-natural Jamaican seasonings are a game changer when it comes to adding a burst of flavor to your dishes. Our products are kosher, all-natural, contains ingredients that are gluten-free and GMO-free. Our seasonings are handcrafted with the highest quality ingredients. We source our ingredients from the Caribbean to capture the authentic taste of the islands. Unleash your creativity in the kitchen and savor the taste of the Caribbean with our spice blends.
All right. Do continue, sis.
All right. I'm trying to rush through this right quick. But shout out Caribbean Kitchen because I'm still making these fire curries with my seasonings. Love
I keep
it.
telling people we don't promote no garbage up here.
That's so good. So good. But just to return back to this picture in the Kali worship, Kali is seen and invoked as this symbol of supreme feminine sovereignty and feminine empowerment, and she's strong and she's so dominant. And that goes back to what we talked about previously, the toxic femininity, this feminist spirit of domination. And we have to be very careful when these deities are worshipped. And furthermore, it should make sense. That's why, again, Yeshua says we have to be childlike. When you look through a child's eyes, and that's why I love being a mother, I love seeing life through the eyes of my children, because children are so pure. They see things for what they really are. And I often think about these very women and men, who worship these types of deities. I mean, if you really look at it, why would you worship something that looks like this? We can talk about the imagery and the symbolism and the allegory and the archetypal nature of these images, which is valid. I do not endorse worshiping these deities in any form or fashion, but even myself, coming from a strong background of and love of Jungian psychology, I still love to research different traditions and even different deities from an archetypal standpoint. I understand quite fully the archetypal significance of these symbols and these figures and their iconography. However, when you think about why are people worshiping that? Why does that look good to you? If you were to show any child this picture, they would see that as frightening. And they should. We should. Why would we want to worship, why would we want to worship this type of deity? that looks like this. Just taking it even at face value, it should show you that there's something diabolical here. But nonetheless, bring attention back to the shamelessness that Kali embodies, literally dancing on top of the man, the symbolism of dominance and aggression that evokes, and that women are being empowered by this, so much so that I've been saying this for years and years and years. This twerking thing is a spirit. Y'all think it's just fun and games and but when you start to notice, it's a sickness. I started noticing years ago when world star hip-hop was still this big thing. These women, it's like they possess. You could be dropping it in the middle of Walmart. You last year we saw the controversy of the women twerking all on the tables at the restaurant at brunch in the middle of the day. This debauchery. And if you really look, it is literally like a possession. They all make the same face. It could not even be no music playing. And they will get up there and just start twerking at the drop of a dime and do the same facial expression. Their tongue is out. Why is this? Why? Like, it should show you that there's a spirit to this thing. And when we go into Aleister Crowley and this anal worship, and this is what I'm about to get to even in the next slide, Baal Peor worship. Aleister Crowley, all these celebrities, are disciples essentially of Aleister Crowley, Crowleyan theories, Crowleyan magic, which glorifies anal worship and sodomy. And this is why now you hear our people. You saw the video of Young Miami and Trina talking about they love to get urinated on. We saw Sukiana being dragged around like a dog on a leash and making songs about eating the ASS. Why are we glorifying this as a culture? We saw Kevin Gates talking about how he is so fond of analingus. Why is this becoming normal? When, to keep it quite 100, we all know back in the 90s, it was a lot of brothers who wouldn't even do oral, cunnilingus, let alone analingus. It was a lot of brothers who wouldn't even submit to the emasculation of going down on a woman vaginally, let alone anally. Why is this being promoted specifically in our community?
I'll tell you why it's being promoted in the form. I'll tell you why it's being promoted in the form of our sisters' comments. Because you got teachers out here talking about when you do that, it unlocks the kundalini.
Yes, exactly. That's
control.
What I was going to get to.
Out of control.
The kundalini energy, the root chakra. And years ago, people, I used to say this with friends, that root chakra energy, even the music has been attuned deliberately to target the root chakra. Remember that interview with Michael Jackson and Oprah when she was like, well, why do you grab your crotch? And he was like, well, the music just makes me do it. That's very true. Now, I don't know whether that's a gimmick of his or not, but that's very true. And I've actually tested it and experimented on it with my friends. If you listen to different types of music, you can put on different songs from different genres, different frequencies, and you will see different parts of your body will move unwillingly. You're not even trying to. You're not trying to do a specific choreography or a specific dance move. You will see that certain music moves your body in a certain way. Why now do we have this bass heavy music attuned to such a frequency that we automatically have to move our hips, move our pelvis in a certain way? But, it's the Baal Peor worship. And I really want to drop the link to that article, which comes from the oral traditions and the rabbinical interpretations, even of the Parashat, why Baal Peor worship was such an abomination for our people. And this is what the likes of Malachi York are talking about. This is what Aleister Crowley is talking about. This is what's being enforced upon our people. And it comes from this slippery slope of feminism, the slippery slope of goddess worship. And, we have to see that that's just not the way. So, it's on mute.
My fault. On that note, everybody, we do got to go. There will be a part 2 because she's going to touch on alchemy as it relates to the relationship between Yeshua and Mary Magdalene, as well as the anointing of kings, right? That part 2 is going to be everything, y'all. We'll announce the day and the time. We might even run it back tomorrow if the time, permits. But we certainly will be having that within the next coming days. Princess Hadassah. Thank you very much. I apologize for having you on almost a clock today because of my time and me having to be somewhere.
Not
But
at
I
all.
appreciate you coming through and doing this, and we will certainly run it back. We got to do a part 2. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Nasi. Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right, everybody. Take care and shalom.
Shalom.